The millionaire's son, a child with Down syndrome, hadn't eaten for days until the new nanny, humble and sweet, did something simple but incredible. Within minutes, the silence in the house transformed, and the millionaire father was left completely speechless. The Sterling mansion was a mausoleum of marble and silence, where the only constant sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock in the grand hall, marking the empty hours with cruel precision. Arthur Sterling, the master of it all, felt each tick like a nail in his chest. Outside the high walls, his name was synonymous with success, a multi-millionaire who had transformed his family's legacy into an empire of business and investments that spanned continents. His fortune swelled with every new opening bell on Wall Street, and each percentage point of profit on his assets seemed to carve another inch of emptiness into his soul. His net worth in dollars and euros was incalculable, an ocean of numbers that couldn't fill the void left by his wife, Helen. Since she was gone, Arthur had become a man of stone, methodical, cold, incapable of feeling. The world of business, with its logic of capital and returns, was his only refuge. Their emotions had no place. But inside his home, failure stared him in the face every day in the most painful way possible. His son, Leo, a 7-year-old angel with his mother's kind eyes and the gentle spirit of Down syndrome, had lost his light. For weeks, the boy had barely eaten. He would sit at the immense dining table before dishes crafted by the head housekeeper and simply stare into nothingness, as if the world had lost its flavor along with Helen's smile. Renowned doctors, expensive therapists, caregivers with impeccable resumes. They had all failed. None of them could break through the wall of sadness that enveloped the little boy. Arthur watched from a distance, from the threshold of his office, feeling impotence corrode what little was left of his heart. What good was all his money if he couldn't buy back his own son's joy? That was an investment for which there was no return. An emotional liability his analytical mind couldn't solve. That morning, however, something different happened. The doorbell chimed through the house right on time. The new nanny had arrived. Arthur watched her from his office window, skeptical. She was a simple woman, with modest clothes and a face that seemed to carry more stories than years. Beatrice, the head housekeeper who had run the house with an iron fist for 2 decades, received her at the door with a look of disdain. "She won't last a week," she muttered to herself, just loud enough for Arthur to hear. But the woman, who introduced herself as Sophia, was not intimidated by the coldness of the environment. She carried a tenderness in her eyes that seemed out of place amidst so much luxury and pain. She had no diplomas hanging on a wall, but she carried in her heart something that none of the previous specialists possessed, an empathy that didn't come from books. When Beatrice led her to the dining room and she saw Leo, frozen in his chair, something in her chest tightened. She didn't see him as a problem to be solved, a patient to be treated. She saw a child who needed to be listened to with the heart. Ignoring the housekeeper's rigid protocol, Sophia approached slowly, knelt beside the boy's chair, and said nothing. She just stayed there in silence, sharing his stillness. Then, with a gentle gesture, she took a small wooden bird from her pocket, smooth and worn by time. Without trying to force an interaction, she began to play with the object in her own hands, making it fly in slow circles while humming an old folk tune, almost a whisper. The ticking of the clock seemed to stop. Beatrice rolled her eyes, ready to intervene. Arthur, hidden in the shadows of the hallway, felt a pang of irritation at the useless scene. But then it happened. Leo, who hadn't shown a genuine reaction in months, slowly turned his head. His eyes, once dull and lost, focused for the first time on the small wooden bird dancing in the air. Arthur Sterling's eyes remained fixed on the scene, a sliver of light in his fortress of apathy. For an instant, the calculating businessman, the man who measured the world in profits and losses, disappeared. All that was left was a father, witnessing the first glimpse of interest in his son's eyes in an eternity. It was a fleeting moment, lasting only the space of a breath, but it was enough to plant a seed of doubt in his hardened heart. Leo didn't move again, but he didn't retreat either. His eyes remained on the wooden bird, now still in Sophia's hand, as if deciphering an ancient secret. Beatrice, however, did not share in this silent epiphany. To her, this was a breach of protocol, an unacceptable familiarity. With a throat clearing that cut the air like a knife, she approached. "Breakfast is over. The boy needs to follow his activity schedule." Her voice was a decree, the embodiment of the cold order that governed the house. Sophia looked up, her serenity a stark contrast to the housekeeper's rigidity. She didn't argue. She simply put the bird back in her pocket and whispered to Leo, "It's okay, champ. I'll see you later." Throughout the day, Sophia followed her own methodology, one not found in any childcare manual. She didn't try to teach Leo anything, didn't force him into educational games or make him follow a strict schedule. Instead, she simply existed in the same space as him. When the boy sat on the playroom rug, staring at the wall, she would sit at a respectful distance and begin to draw in a sketchbook, narrating in a low voice the shapes she was creating. "Now, I'm going to make a house with a very tall chimney, and out of the chimney comes smoke that dances with the wind." She spoke to the silence as if it were an interlocutor, a pause, not an insurmountable barrier. Arthur watched it all from a distance, through the security cameras he monitored in his office, a habit that had become a form of torture. He felt like an intruder in his own home, a spectator to a life he couldn't reach. The scene irritated and fascinated him in equal measure. "It's a waste of time," his pragmatic mind screamed. His son's human capital was depreciating with every day of inertia. Unable to contain his frustration, he finally left his office and confronted her in the hallway. "Miss Sophia, I believe I wasn't clear about my expectations. Leo needs stimulation, discipline. He doesn't need music and drawings." His voice was controlled, the same one he used to close multi-million-dollar deals, cold and devoid of emotion. Sophia met his gaze, her eyes conveying a firmness that disarmed him. "With all due respect, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice calm but unshakable, "what he needs is someone who won't give up. The discipline will come when he feels safe again. His soul needs silence to heal, not more orders." The answer hit him like a punch. No one had ever spoken to him that way, much less a simple nanny. He, the billionaire who built a monumental fortune, was being taught what his own son needed by a woman who possessed nothing but her conviction. He turned and went back to his office, slamming the door, not out of anger, but to hide the confusion she had planted in his chest. At night, the scene repeated itself at the dinner table. Leo's plate, a nutritious and bland, pureed vegetable soup, remained untouched. Beatrice shot a triumphant glance in Sophia's direction. A silent, "I told you so." Arthur's heart sank. The morning's hope had dissipated, leaving only the bitter residue of reality. He was about to get up and end this daily theater of failure when Sophia did something unexpected. She took the spoon, dipped it in the soup, and instead of bringing it to Leo's mouth, she began to draw a winding path on the plate. "Once upon a time, there was a little golden road that led to a mountain of secrets," she whispered, her voice weaving a story in the air. Leo, who had been staring at the crystal chandelier, slowly lowered his eyes to the plate. Arthur held his breath. Beatrice leaned forward, incredulous. The boy watched the drawing for a long moment, his small lips parted. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he raised his trembling little hand, not to push the plate away, but to touch the beginning of the soup road Sophia had created. The trembling touch of Leo's finger on the soup road was like a spark in a dry field. The silence in the dining room grew dense, charged with an expectation that had long been absent. Arthur held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs with a force that startled him. Beatrice, for her part, stiffened, her thin lips pressed into a line of disapproval. This was a mess, an unacceptable breach of all the rules of etiquette she had strived to maintain. But Sophia didn't seem to notice the tension around them. Her eyes were fixed on Leo, and in them was a universe of patience. With a gentle smile, she picked up the spoon again and held it in the air. "And now, the treasure airplane is about to take off," she announced, her voice full of a contagious enthusiasm. "It needs fuel to get to the mountain of secrets, making the engine sound. Vroom, vroom." She moved the spoon in a graceful arc through the air, the engine sound vibrating on her lips. Arthur felt a lump form in his throat. He remembered Helen playing the same game years ago, when the house was still a home and not a monument to his wealth. The memory hit him with the force of a wave, painful and yet strangely comforting. He expected Leo to pull away, for the spell to break, as it always did. But to his astonishment, the boy followed the spoon's flight with his eyes, a flicker of genuine curiosity dawning on his face. When the airplane approached, he didn't retreat. Instead, he opened his mouth, a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but to Arthur, it was like watching the sun rise after an endless night. The spoon went in, and Leo swallowed. Sophia didn't celebrate. She just continued the game, with the same naturalness as breathing. Refueled, now let's fly over the napkin clouds. And on the third spoonful, the miracle happened. A sound bubbled up in Leo's chest, fragile at first, like a soap bubble, and then it grew, escaping his lips in a pure, crystalline laugh. The sound ricocheted off the high walls, the cold marble, the crystal chandeliers, and shattered the funereal silence of the Sterling mansion. It was a sound Arthur thought he would never hear again. He felt the floor disappear from under his feet, the air leave his lungs. A single, stubborn tear escaped his control and traced a path down his face, the first in years. He wiped it away quickly, before anyone could see his weakness. Beatrice was paralyzed, her face a mask of shock and envy. This woman, in less than 3 days, had accomplished what a team of specialists and years of her own dedication could not. For the first time in months, Leo ate, not all of it, but enough, and he did it with a smile. Later that night, Arthur was in his office, trying to focus on stock market charts, on the cash flow of his businesses, on the concrete world of numbers where he felt safe. But the image of Leo laughing and the sound of that laughter overrode everything. His empire, his fortune, the entire legacy he had built seemed insignificant in the face of that moment. It was then that he heard a soft knock on the door. It was Sophia with Leo beside her, already in his pajamas. "We just came to say good night," she said, her voice serene. Leo was holding a crumpled piece of paper. With a gentle nudge from Sophia, he approached his father and held out the drawing. It was 3 clumsy stick figures with wide smiles. One was big, one was small, and the third was a female figure with long hair. They were holding hands under a happy yellow sun. When Arthur took it, confused, Leo pointed with his little finger at each figure. "Daddy." "Leo," he said, his voice a bit hesitant. Then his finger landed on the female figure, and he looked at Sophia, then back at his father, and said with a clarity that made Arthur's heart stop, "Sophia." She was the third figure. He already saw her as part of them. Arthur was speechless, the drawing trembling in his hands, the weight of that simple truth crushing him. When he looked up, Sophia was quietly excusing herself, giving them their privacy. In the last second, before the door closed, he managed to find his voice. "Sophia." Arthur's voice came out hoarse, a strange sound in the emotionally charged silence. Sophia paused at the threshold, turning slowly, her face lit with an expression of quiet expectation. Leo was still standing beside his father's desk. looking at the drawing in his hands as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Arthur swallowed hard, trying to organize the avalanche of feelings overwhelming him. For years, he had communicated through lawyers, assistants, and numbers. Expressing gratitude was a foreign language he had forgotten. He began, the word trailing off. He cleared his throat, pride battling the need to acknowledge the miracle he had witnessed. Thank you. It was just one word, spoken in a near inaudible tone, but to Sophia it resonated like thunder. She offered a small smile, a gesture that asked for nothing in return, only confirming that she understood. He's an amazing boy, Mr. Sterling. He just needed a chance to show us. She placed a kiss on Leo's forehead and left, closing the door softly, leaving father and son alone with this new, fragile beginning. In the days that followed, the Sterling mansion began to undergo a subtle but profound transformation. The change wasn't in the furniture or the decor, but in the air. The oppressive silence was gradually replaced by the sounds of an awakening life. Sophia's voice, singing lullabies, echoed through the hallways. Leo's laughter, now more frequent, punctuated the afternoons. And to Beatrice's astonishment, the smell of home-cooked food began to waft from the kitchen at unexpected hours. Sophia, with Arthur's hesitant permission, started preparing small snacks for Leo, turning fruit into smiling faces and vegetables into trees in an enchanted forest. The house, once a temple of rigid routines and formal meals, gained a warmth that was slowly turning it into a home. Arthur himself found he was changing. He started leaving his office door open. Then he began working at the large library table, from where he could hear, even from a distance, the interaction between Sophia and his son. Every laugh from Leo was an unexpected dividend for his soul, a profit that none of his stocks could ever yield. One afternoon, he came downstairs for coffee and found Sophia and Leo sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by cushions, building a castle out of blocks. The scene was so domestic, so full of a genuine peace, that he stopped to watch. Sophia was completely immersed in the game, instructing Leo on how to balance the highest tower. When Leo managed to place the last block without toppling the structure, he clapped his hands, exultant. Sophia hugged him, laughing with him, and in that moment, when she looked up, her eyes shining with joy, and her gaze met Arthur's, he felt something stir in his chest. A pang of tenderness, a warmth he hadn't allowed himself to feel since Helen's death. It was disconcerting, like the first crack in a glacier. He felt vulnerable, exposed. That feeling was not part of his plans. It didn't fit into his controlled life. Startled by his own reaction, he turned away, his heart racing, and retreated back to the safety of his office, the taste of coffee forgotten in his mouth. Beatrice watched everything with a growing resentment. Every one of Leo's smiles, every word of gratitude from Arthur to Sophia was an affront to her dominion, an invalidation of her years of loyal service. She, who had cared for the Sterling house and family with an almost fanatical devotion, was being eclipsed by a newcomer. Jealousy, like a poison ivy, began to take over her thoughts. She saw the growing affection between Arthur and Sophia not as a balm for the wounded family, but as a cunning plan. "She's taking advantage of the master's vulnerability," she would whisper to the other staff, planting seeds of mistrust. "A woman like her, coming from nothing, can only be interested in the fortune, the family's assets." She started to watch Sophia, looking for a flaw, a slip-up, anything she could use to prove she was right and restore the old order. The opportunity, she felt, would come soon. The happiness blooming in that house was too fragile, and Beatrice was determined to be the frost that would kill it. The fragile peace that had settled over the Sterling mansion was shattered on a grey Tuesday, with the arrival of an imported sedan that slid silently over the gravel driveway. From it stepped Isabel, Helen's older sister. She was a woman carved from ice and tradition, whose rare visits were always synonymous with inspection and judgment. She entered the house like a queen in her territory, her eyes sweeping every corner for dust or disorder. Arthur greeted her with the forced cordiality he reserved for his late wife's relatives, a constant reminder of his social obligations and his loss. Isabel's gaze, however, did not linger on the impeccable decor. It landed, with the precision of a predator, on the scene unfolding in the living room. Leo and Sophia were on the rug, laughing as they assembled a farm animal puzzle. Sophia was making the sound of each animal, and Leo, in a burst of progress, was trying to imitate her. It was a moment of pure, simple joy, but Isabel saw none of it. She saw only a breach of a mourning period that, in her opinion, should be perpetual. She waited until Sophia had taken Leo to his room for his afternoon nap before launching her attack. She turned to Arthur, her face a mask of disappointment. "What is happening in this house, Arthur? What is this spectacle?" Her voice was low but sharp. "You're allowing some nobody," she spat the word, "to turn my sister's home into a circus. Helen valued order, discretion, and you replace her with this." Arthur felt his blood run cold. "She's Leo's nanny, Isabel, and she's doing a good job. He's eating again, smiling." The defense sounded weak, even to his own ears. Isabel let out a dry, humorless laugh. "He's smiling because she treats him like a fool with her simple-minded games. What will people think? What would your business partners say if they saw the heir to your empire behaving like this? You've built a massive fortune. You run $1 billion business, yet you're letting a stranger dictate the rules of your house and your son's upbringing. Think of Leo's inheritance, not just the financial one, but that of his name, his position." Every word was a direct hit on Arthur's weakest points, his pride and his guilt. The gratitude he felt for Sophia began to mix with a toxic feeling of shame. He, Arthur Sterling, a man whose life was an example of control and power, was being seen as weak, influenced by an employee. The tenderness he'd felt watching her smile now seemed like a trap, a vulnerability he couldn't afford. Isabel had re-erected the walls around his heart with devastating efficiency. He saw Sophia through her eyes, a poor, simple woman, an anomaly in his world of wealth and power. The connection he'd felt was a risk, an emotional liability that could compromise everything he had built. Fear, cold and familiar, took hold once more. When Sophia came down the stairs, humming softly, she found a transformed Arthur. The man who had looked at her with veiled tenderness the night before was gone. In his place was the employer, distant and impenetrable. "Miss Sophia," he said, his formal tone cutting the air, "my sister-in-law and I were discussing Leo's routine, and we've come to a conclusion." Sophia felt a chill run down her spine. The smile died on her lips. She looked from Arthur to Isabel, who was staring at her with ill-disguised triumph. "Starting tomorrow," Arthur continued, unable to look her in the eye, "you will strictly follow the schedule prepared by the therapists. Rigid times for meals, therapy, and learning. No more." He hesitated, the word sounding cruel in his own mouth. "Games." Arthur's command, fueled by Isabel's venomous words, fell upon the house like an unseasonable frost. The routine, once an invisible skeleton that supported life, became an iron cage. Sophia, her heart aching, tried to adapt. Meals became silent and timed again. Toys were replaced with visual stimulation flashcards, and songs gave way to speech therapy exercises repeated ad nauseum. She followed the orders, but her eyes, once full of light, now carried a veiled sadness, and Leo, with the pure intuition of children, felt the change immediately. His smile became rare, his laughter vanished, and food once again became an obstacle instead of an adventure. He didn't regress to his former silence, but a shadow of apathy returned to hang over him. Beatrice supervised everything with ill-concealed satisfaction, seeing the restoration of her authority as a personal victory. For her, the house was once again a precision machine, not a nest of unruly emotions. Arthur watched from his office, trying to convince himself he had done the right thing. He looked at his investment charts, at the profitability of his funds, and tried to apply the same logic to his personal life. He was protecting his assets, his legacy, his son. He was eliminating a risk, an unpredictable element that could destabilize his carefully constructed world. But the chart of Leo's happiness was in a nosedive, and that was an asset he didn't know how to recover. Every empty look from his son was a painful interest payment on the debt he had incurred with his own cowardice. The tenderness he had felt for Sophia now seemed like a high-risk investment, and he had pulled out, selling his shares at the first sign of volatility. He was a coward, and the billionaire inside him hated to admit it. At the end of the week, Leo's fragile system gave out. He woke up with a fever, his cheeks flushed and his body limp. The doctor came, diagnosed a common virus, and prescribed rest and care. During the day, Sophia followed the instructions to the letter, but within the new, rigid structure. She took his temperature, administered medicine at the exact time, but she couldn't sing to him or tell him a story. She felt her hands were tied, a caregiver whose primary tool, affection, had been confiscated. At night, Leo's fever spiked. Restless, he tossed and turned in bed, murmuring disconnected words. Arthur watched him on the camera in his room, his heart in a knot. Amidst the feverish babbling, one name emerged with clarity: Sophia. Sophia. The word cut through the monitor and hit Arthur like a fist. He called the kitchen, where Beatrice was, and asked about the boy. "It's just a fever, sir. He needs to learn to soothe himself. Calling for the nanny at every discomfort will only harm his independence," she replied, her voice cold as steel. But Leo's calls continued, a low, persistent lament. Unable to focus on any business, Arthur shut down his monitors and walked silently down the dark hallway toward his son's room. The house was quiet, but as he neared the door, he heard a sound, a soft whisper, an almost imperceptible melody. He opened the door a crack, his heart pounding, and then he saw her. Sophia was there, defying his orders, seated in a small chair beside the bed. She was dabbing Leo's forehead with a damp cloth. The fever had broken, and he was finally sleeping a deep, peaceful sleep. His small hand was clutched around Sophia's finger, holding onto her like an anchor in a stormy sea, and she, exhausted, had fallen asleep in the chair, her head slumped to the side, her face serene, never letting go of the boy's hand. The image, so pure in its devotion, disarmed Arthur completely. The tenderness of the scene hit him not like a pang, but like a flood, breaking through all the barriers of pride and fear. He covered them both with a blanket, an instinctive gesture that surprised him. And as he left the room, closing the door with infinite care, he knew that something inside him had changed forever. The following morning dawned grey and damp, a reflection of Arthur Sterling's state of mind. The image of Sophia asleep, holding Leo's hand, was seared into his memory, a scene of devotion so pure it defied the cynical logic with which he governed his life and business. For the first time in a long time, he felt the possibility of a different future, one where the net worth of his happiness could actually grow. That feeling, however, was as terrifying as it was welcome. It was a volatile asset, a high-risk investment in an emotional market he didn't control. Isabel's voice still echoed in his head. A conservative board of directors, warning against impulsive moves that could compromise his entire structure. He was divided, a man at war with himself, tenderness battling pride, his heart against the best practices manual of a multi-millionaire. Beatrice's, however, was not living in a state of ambivalence. When she entered Leo's room that morning to open the curtains and found the master's cashmere blanket draped over the nanny and the boy, she understood everything. That gesture was more than an act of kindness. It was a seal of approval, a direct threat to her position and the orderly universe she had built. Jealousy and fear solidified into a cold, calculated resolve. She had to act, and fast. She had to prove that Sophia was an element of disorder, a dangerous liability, and for that she would set a trap with the precision of a watchmaker. The opportunity arose that afternoon. Leo, his fever gone and his energy renewed, was playing in the music room, a rarely used space with a thick Persian rug. Beatrice entered carrying an old portrait of Helen, its frame made of delicate crystal. With a perfectly rehearsed cry of surprise, she let it slip from her hands. The crystal shattered on the hardwood floor next to the rug, scattering glittering shards. "Oh, dear heavens, what a disaster!" she lamented, her voice laden with false dismay. Sophia, who was with Leo, immediately stood up to help. "Let me handle this, Beatrice. Please take Leo to the playroom so he doesn't get hurt." As Sophia went to get a dustpan and broom, Beatrice took Leo by the hand, but not before subtly kicking a small, sharp sliver of crystal under the edge of the Persian rug, where a broom would never reach. Later, when the room was supposedly clean and safe, Sophia brought Leo back so he could play with his toy xylophone. As she turned for a second to put away the boy's medicine bag, Beatrice's calculated tragedy came to pass. Leo, drawn by the glint of the hidden shard, crawled to the edge of the rug and picked it up. The sharp point pricked his palm, a tiny cut, but enough to frighten him. The boy's cry, sharp and scared, echoed through the house. Beatrice appeared in the doorway as if on cue. "My God, what happened?" she shrieked, rushing to the boy and snatching the shard from his hand. She held it up to the light so that Arthur, who appeared in the hallway drawn by the cry, could see the glint of glass and the small drop of blood on his son's hand. "Negligence! I warned you! She left a piece of glass within his reach. He could have been seriously hurt," Beatrice accused. Her voice trembling with theatrical fury, Sophia stood pale in shock. "I cleaned everything. I swear I cleaned it." Arthur looked at his crying son, at the blood, at the glass in the housekeeper's hand, and at Sophia's terrified face. The pressure, the confusion, and the fear consumed him. Isabel's voice, the warning about protecting his son and his name, the need to eliminate risk, it all converged at a single, terrible point. He didn't hear Sophia's explanations. He saw only the proof that she was a danger. "Enough," he said, his voice cold as ice, devoid of any emotion. "Pack your things. You're fired." The word "fired" hung in the air, cold and irrevocable. For Sophia, the sound was sharper than the shattering crystal. She looked at Arthur, her eyes pleading for a chance to explain, for a glimpse of the man who had covered her and Leo with a blanket the night before. But he wouldn't meet her gaze. His eyes were fixed on Leo, who was now sobbing in Beatrice's arms, more frightened by the tension in the room than by the tiny scratch on his hand. The housekeeper shot Sophia a look of frigid triumph over the boy's shoulder. The trap had worked with cruel perfection. Sophia's heart shattered, not for the loss of her job, but for the pain she saw beginning to form again in Leo's eyes. She knew this crying was just the beginning. He wasn't just losing his nanny. He was losing for a second time the sense of safety and affection he had only just begun to rebuild. "Mr. Sterling, please," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I would never hurt him." But Arthur had already turned away, his broad, rigid back an impassable wall. "See Miss Sophia out, Beatrice," he said without looking back, and retreated to his office, closing the door with a finality that sealed all their fates. Sophia's departure was swift and silent. She packed her few belongings into a small bag, her heart as heavy as lead. As she passed through the living room, She saw Leo on the sofa, his gaze lost, the same empty look she had found on her first day. He refused to look at her, shrinking away when she tried to approach for a goodbye. That gesture hurt more than Arthur's accusation. She left the mansion under Beatrice's watchful eye, feeling as though she were leaving a piece of her own soul behind. The iron gate closed behind her, and the house plunged back into its familiar, oppressive silence. In the days that followed, Arthur tried to convince himself that he had made the right decision. The house was safe. Order was restored. Beatrice was, once again, the undisputed queen of that marble castle. But the peace he expected never came. The silence that returned was not one of tranquility, but of absence. The mansion was no longer a mausoleum. It was a tomb. Leo shut down completely. The fragile bridge Sophia had built to reach his inner world collapsed, leaving him stranded on his island of sorrow. He stopped eating again. He would sit at the table, motionless, while Beatrice tried, in vain, all the techniques she had learned from watching Sophia, but she lacked the essential ingredient, love. The food airplane wouldn't take off. The soup roads led nowhere. Leo's laughter became a distant memory, an echo in an empty house. Arthur watched his son's decline with a growing desperation. The fortune he managed, the businesses that flourished. It all seemed like a sick joke. He had all the money in the world, but he felt like the poorest man alive. His wealth couldn't buy the sound of his son's laughter. One night, a violent storm broke over the city, the wind howling and the rain lashing against the windows as if nature itself were weeping with him. Unable to sleep, Arthur wandered through the dark house. The ticking of the clock seemed to mock him, marking every second of his failure. He went into Leo's room and found him awake, sitting up in bed, hugging his knees, watching the lightning tear across the sky. Arthur sat beside him, but the boy didn't react. The chasm between them seemed wider than ever. As he got up to leave, his foot bumped into something under the bed. He bent down and picked it up. It was a crumpled piece of paper. As he unfolded it in the dim glow of the lamp, his heart stopped. It was the drawing. The three clumsy figures holding hands under a happy sun, Daddy, Leo, Sophia. The paper trembled in his hand, and then, for the first time in years, Arthur Sterling, the billionaire made of stone, broke down. He sat on the floor, leaning against his son's bed, and wept, silent, racking sobs that shook his body, releasing years of repressed pain, guilt, and loneliness. The storm that had raged inside Arthur during the night had the paradoxical effect of washing away the dust from his pride. At dawn, as the first pale rays of sun touched the wet garden soil, the searing pain in his chest had transformed into a cold, sharp clarity. His sobs in the darkness of Leo's room had not been an act of weakness, but of surrender. He surrendered to the truth he had been trying to suppress. He had made a terrible mistake, one that couldn't be fixed with money, with lawyers, or with the ruthless logic of his business. The balance sheet of his life was in the red, and the most precious asset in his portfolio, his son's happiness, was depreciating at an alarming rate. He needed Sophia, not as an employee, but as the only person who seemed to understand the language of Leo's soul. The question was, how could he find her? Driven by a desperation stronger than any ambition he had ever felt, he began his search. He, the multimillionaire who could track the cash flow of international corporations and predict the movements of the stock market, felt utterly powerless. Sophia's hiring file contained an old address in a neighborhood that barely registered on the city's luxury maps. He went to the employment agency that had recommended her, an impersonal place with generic furniture. He offered a generous sum for information, but the receptionist, loyal to company policy, refused to provide personal data on former candidates. For the first time in decades, his money was useless. Frustration gnawed at him. He could buy gold, trade bitcoins, move mountains of capital with a phone call, But he couldn't find a simple woman who had brought light into his home. Back in his office, surrounded by the symbols of his wealth and power, he felt like a prisoner. The monitors displayed green charts of profits and dividends, but all he saw was Leo's sad face. Tired of staring at the failure of his emotional investments, he opened the local news portal on his tablet, an old habit to keep up with the city's business climate. His eyes scanned headlines about politics and the economy without registering a thing. He was about to give up when a small story in the community section caught his eye. The photo showed a group of smiling children in a colorful garden. The headline was simple: "Snack Time Magic. Woman transforms mealtimes for special needs kids." He clicked. A short video began to play. The amateur camera was a bit shaky, but the scene was clear. In a modest neighborhood, with small houses and flower-lined fences, a group of children with different needs were sitting around a picnic table. And there, at the center of it all, was her, Sophia. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she was wearing an apron stained with mashed potatoes. But her smile was the same, radiant and genuine. She was singing the same airplane tune, turning pieces of fruit into a colorful train. The children, perhaps once as withdrawn as Leo, were eating and laughing, their faces lit up by the attention and affection she showered on them. Arthur felt the air leave his lungs. She wasn't just caring for them. She was performing daily miracles in a setting devoid of any luxury. It was a community center, the report said, run on donations. He paused the video on her face, a mixture of pain and admiration washing over him. Without a second thought, he stood up, ignoring the phone ringing with an urgent international call. He grabbed his car keys from the desk, determination etched on his face. He didn't need investigators. He needed to go there. He needed to fix what he had broken. Arthur drove through the streets of the simple neighborhood, the powerful engine of his luxury car sounding like an insult to the modesty of the surrounding homes. The rain was falling mercilessly, turning the world into a blur of gray and green. Every drop on the windshield felt like an accusation. Every turn took him further from his world of concrete, steel, and numbers, and closer to a truth he could no longer ignore. He found the street, a quiet lane lined with small, well-tended gardens. He spotted the community center, a corner house painted a cheerful yellow that defied the gloom of the day. He parked across the street, his heart hammering against his ribs, a mix of hope and dread. And then, his heart stopped. There, in the small front yard, sheltered from the rain by a colorful awning, was Leo. The question of how he had gotten there, whether he had run away while Beatrice was distracted by her routines, whether some primal instinct had guided him, evaporated, replaced by a wave of relief so overwhelming it left him breathless. Leo wasn't crying. He didn't look lost. He was sitting at a small chair, at a table with other children, laughing, a genuine laugh, one Arthur hadn't heard in an eternity. And beside him, holding a spoon shaped like an airplane, was Sophia. She was singing the same song softly, her face illuminated by that unique tenderness of hers. Seeing them together, in that scene of heart-wrenching normality, was the final revelation. All his fortune, his countless assets, and his net worth in dollars seemed like dust, insignificant before the wealth of that moment. This was the real treasure, the inheritance that truly mattered, and he had thrown it away for pride and fear. He opened the car door and stepped out, not caring about the rain that instantly soaked him, plastering his expensive shirt to his body. Each step toward the small wooden fence was heavy, as if he were walking against a current of regret. Sophia saw him first. Her eyes widened, and the smile on her lips vanished, replaced by an expression of shock and caution. She rose slowly, a protective gesture toward the children. Leo's laughter ceased when he saw his father, his face suddenly serious, his eyes trying to understand this collision of his two worlds. Arthur stopped at the gate, the rain streaming down his face, mixing with the tears he no longer tried to hide. He looked at Sophia, at Leo, and opened his heart. His voice came out broken, a whisper torn by emotion. "I was a coward." The words hung in the damp air, heavy with the weight of weeks of pain. He took a step into the yard, his expensive shoes sinking into the wet grass. "I thought I was protecting Leo from you, that I was protecting my world, my order. But the truth is, I was running away from what my son and I needed most, love." Sophia stared at him in silence, her face unreadable, her heart beating wildly. The pain of the dismissal, the injustice, it all came flooding back. But it was overshadowed by the raw vulnerability of this man who seemed to have shrunk before her. It was Leo who broke the spell. He climbed down from his chair, walked with his hesitant little steps to his father, and took his wet hand. Then he turned, went to Sophia, and took her hand. With a surprising strength for his size, he pulled them toward each other until they were side by side. He looked up, first at his father, then at Sophia, and placed their hands together, joining them between his own. The contact of Sophia's warm skin against his, cold from the rain, was like an electric shock to Arthur. He looked down at their hands, held together by his son, the living link between them, and then up at her face, waiting for a verdict that would define the rest of his life. The silence that followed Leo's gesture was thick and charged, more eloquent than any words. The rain began to subside, as if the sky itself were holding its breath, awaiting a resolution. Arthur felt the warmth of Sophia's hand spread through his body, an antidote to the cold that had consumed him from within. He held her gaze, stripped of his defenses, of the billionaire's pride, of the employer's arrogance. He was just a man, broken and repentant, asking for a second chance, not with words, but with the soul laid bare in his tear-filled eyes. Sophia watched him for a long moment, her heart a storm of conflicting emotions. The hurt was there, the memory of humiliation and injustice, but layered over it was the image of the rain-soaked man weeping in her yard, the sight of Leo joining their hands, and above all, the unconditional love she felt for that little boy. She knew that forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past, but about rewriting the future. Finally, she spoke, her voice firm yet infused with a tenderness that disarmed him completely. "I'll come back," she said, and Arthur's heart leaped with relief, but she continued, and her next words changed everything. "But not to work for you, Arthur. I won't come back as your employee." He felt a chill, the fear of rejection returning. She squeezed his hand gently, as if to calm him. "I'll come back to take care of you, both of you, together." The word "together" resonated in the air, not as a term in an employment contract, but as the main clause of a life agreement. It wasn't about salary or position, it was about belonging. It was about forming a family, not on the terms of a convenient arrangement, but on the foundation of mutual need and an affection that had grown in the midst of pain. She was offering not just her care, but her heart. Arthur felt a wave of gratitude so intense it made him dizzy. He didn't deserve this. He knew it. But he would accept this gift with the humility of a man who had lost everything and was being given the universe back. He didn't answer with words. He just nodded slowly, a movement laden with silent promises. Promises that he would never again let fear or pride dictate his actions, that he would honor the trust she was placing in him, that he would do everything to be the man she and Leo deserved. And there, in that small garden in a simple neighborhood, under a sky that was beginning to clear, a new family was born. Not one of blood or social convention, but one forged in overcoming, in forgiveness, and in love. The return to the Sterling mansion was a new beginning. Arthur's first act, carried out with unwavering determination, was to confront Beatrice. He did so calmly, without heated accusations, but with the coldness of a final verdict. He presented her with a generous severance package and permanently dismissed her from her services. The housekeeper, for the first time in decades, was speechless, her face pale with shock as she realized her kingdom of control had crumbled forever. Her departure was the final exorcism of the ghosts that had haunted the house. With her went the rigid rules, the oppressive silence, and the institutional coldness. The house, then, truly began to be reborn. Sophia was no longer the nanny, she was the beating heart of that home. The doors to Arthur's office were permanently opened. The sound of his voice on conference calls about stocks and cash flow began to mingle with the sound of Leo's laughter and Sophia's songs. The smell of home-cooked meals permeated the hallways, and the grand dining table, once a stage for loneliness, became the center of daily gatherings where food was shared with joy and conversation. Leo blossomed. With the security of Sophia's love and the newfound presence of his father, he began to overcome his own limitations, one small miracle at a time. He learned to hold his fork by himself, to form complete sentences, to express his wants and joys with a clarity that moved Arthur every day. The greatest progress, however, was Arthur's own. He began to delegate more in his businesses, to close his laptop earlier, to understand that the greatest investment of his life wasn't in treasury bonds or cryptocurrency, but in the time he spent with the two people he loved. He discovered the simple joy of cooking with Sophia, of reading stories to Leo, of simply being present. The sterling mansion, once a symbol of his material wealth, transformed into a testament to his flourishing emotional fortune. The months that followed were a lesson in rediscovery for Arthur Sterling. He, who had spent his entire life perfecting the art of accumulating capital, was now learning to invest in a different kind of asset: time. He discovered that the return on an afternoon spent in the garden with Leo, teaching him to feel the texture of the leaves, far exceeded the profits of any stock on the market. Wealth, he realized, wasn't in the bank statements his managers sent him, but in the sound of Sophia's laughter echoing from the kitchen, a melody worth more than all the gold stored in a Swiss bank vault. He learned to disconnect. One morning, during breakfast, his phone buzzed incessantly. It was his lead trader calling from New York. A unique opportunity, a fluctuation in the crypto market that could yield millions in profit in a matter of hours. In the past, Arthur would have dropped everything to take the call, the adrenaline of the deal coursing through his veins. But that morning, he looked across the table. Sophia was helping Leo stack pancakes into a wobbly tower, and they were both giggling with each new layer added. The morning sun streamed through the window, bathing the scene in a warm, golden light. This was his true net worth. He silenced the phone and turned it face down on the table. The trader could wait. The market would be there tomorrow. His son's childhood would not. "Everything okay?" Sophia asked, noticing the gesture. "Everything's perfect," he replied, and for the first time, the word felt completely true. His transformation wasn't just behavioral, it was fundamental. He began restructuring his businesses, automating processes, delegating decisions, freeing up his time not for idle leisure, but for active presence. He wanted to be there when Leo said a new word, when Sophia tried a new recipe, when life happened. The biggest change, however, was in how he saw himself. The ruthless multimillionaire gave way to a man who found joy in fixing the broken swing set in the garden, who felt genuine pride watching Leo manage to tie his own shoes, who felt his heart overflow when Sophia fell asleep on his shoulder as they read a book at night. He had been uncomfortable with the word love. It had been too great a liability on his emotional balance sheet for too long, but with Sophia, it felt like the only investment that guaranteed eternal returns. One evening, as Leo slept, he and Sophia were sitting on the porch, looking at the stars. "I never really thanked you, Sophia," he said, his voice low. You didn't just save Leo, you saved me from myself. I was bankrupt in the only way that matters. Sophia took his hand. We saved each other, Arthur. I was lonely too. You two gave me a place to belong. In that comfortable silence, Arthur felt a peace that no inheritance could buy. He was about to say something. Something important, something about the future, when the sharp ring of the doorbell cut through the tranquility of the night. They looked at each other, surprised. They weren't expecting anyone. Arthur stood and walked to the door, pulling it open. Outside, standing under the porch light, was Isabel. Her face was a mask of disbelief and disdain, her eyes darting from Arthur to Sophia, who now stood behind him, and then to Leo's toys scattered on the lawn. She looked him up and down, at his casual clothes, at the look of contentment on his face, and said, her voice dripping with venom, "So it's true. You've completely lost your mind." The calm that washed over Arthur was not one of apathy, but of an unshakable certainty, forged in the fire of regret and tempered by newfound joy. Years ago, Isabel's words would have cut him, striking at his pride and insecurity. Now, they sounded merely like the distant noise of a world to which he no longer belonged. He didn't flinch. He just held Sophia's hand a little tighter, a silent gesture that said, "We are in this together." "Good evening, Isabel," he said, his voice quiet, but with an undercurrent of steel. "We weren't expecting you. Please, come in. It's cold out there." His cordiality, devoid of any agitation, seemed to disorient her more than any angry outburst would have. She stepped inside, her eyes flashing, scanning the room as if searching for more evidence of her brother-in-law's decay. "I didn't come for tea, Arthur. I came to understand what's going on. I received a phone call. Beatrice told me everything. How could you? Firing a woman who dedicated her life to this family, to replace her with her." The contempt in her voice as she gestured toward Sophia was palpable. "Beatrice was generously compensated for her years of service," Arthur replied, guiding Sophia to sit on the sofa and remaining standing beside her, a protective fortress. "And Sophia didn't replace anyone. She filled a void that all the money in the world couldn't buy." Isabel let out a bitter laugh. "Void or naivete? Arthur, you built an empire. Your name is synonymous with power, with business, with a fortune that generations couldn't spend, and you're risking it all, tarnishing my sister's memory for an opportunistic nanny who has clearly taken advantage of your grief." The accusation hung in the air, venomous and cruel. Sophia flinched slightly, the hurt visible on her face. She had never wanted to be the cause of conflict, the point of discord in this family. Arthur felt her movement and placed a hand on her shoulder. It was then that he turned fully to face Isabel, and the calm man gave way to a force of nature. "Enough," he said. His voice low but vibrating with an authority Isabel hadn't heard in years. "You will listen carefully. Your sister's memory was one of love, of laughter, of warmth. This house became a cold tomb after she was gone, a monument to my pride and my pain. I hid behind my portfolio, my inheritance, my business deals. I measured life in profits and losses, and I was utterly bankrupt. This woman," he said, looking at Sophia with an adoration that made her heart race, "didn't take advantage of anything. She reminded me what the true cash flow of life is, a child's happiness. She taught me that the greatest asset I own isn't in a Swiss bank account or in tech stocks. It's right here, in this room." He knelt in front of Sophia, taking both her hands, completely ignoring Isabel's shocked presence. "Love, Isabel. That's the only investment with infinite returns, and I was a fool to take so long to understand that. You speak of Helen's memory. Helen would have loved to see her son smiling again. She would have loved to see this house full of life. You are not protecting her memory. You are using it as a weapon to justify your own prejudice and bitterness." His words, heavy with irrefutable truth, left Isabel speechless. Her face contorted into a mask of rage and humiliation. Defeated in her argument, she resorted to her final weapon. "You will regret this, Arthur," she hissed, her eyes narrowing. "I will make sure our entire social circle, all of your business partners, know how you have dishonored the family name. I will make sure everyone knows you traded Helen's legacy for a fling with the help." Isabel's threat, designed to be the final weapon, the silver bullet that would destroy Arthur's world, dissipated in the room with the force of a whisper against a storm. Arthur looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't see the guardian of his late wife's legacy, but an empty woman, clinging to a concept of honor that fed no one's soul. He felt pity for her. A sad, serene smile touched his lips. "Do it, Isabel," he said, his voice so calm it disarmed her completely. "Call them all. Arrange a lunch at the most expensive club in the city. Tell them that Arthur Sterling has finally understood that the greatest asset a man can have doesn't fit in a vault, isn't measured in stock tickers, and can't be listed on a balance sheet." He took a step forward, and his imposing presence filled the room. Not with menace, but with a newfound authority, that of a man at peace with himself. "Tell them that for years I managed a fortune, but I neglected my one true wealth. Tell them I was so busy calculating the compound interest on my capital that I failed to notice the depreciation of my own heart. And tell them," he continued, turning to Sophia and taking her hand, lacing his fingers through hers, "that this woman, whom you call the help, offered me a kind of inheritance that no money can buy. The chance to be a father again, to be happy, to be human." With every word, Isabel's face transformed, her rage giving way to an impotent bewilderment. She had expected a fight, a denial, an explosion. She had expected to wound and destroy, but there was nothing left for her to destroy. The man she sought to hurt, the proud, image-conscious multimillionaire, no longer existed. "As for my name and my business," Arthur concluded, "if they are so fragile that they would crumble because of love and happiness, then they were never worth having in the first place." He looked her in the eyes, the final verdict clear and irrevocable. "The door is open, Isabel. You can leave and begin your crusade. But know that when you do, you won't be dishonoring Helen's memory. You will only be condemning yourself to a life of loneliness." Defeated, Isabel stood in silence for a long moment. Her power had evaporated. Without Arthur's fear to feed on, her threats were hollow. She turned, her posture stiff and defeated, and walked out of the house, closing the door behind her, a final, echoless sound that sealed the end of an era. The peace that descended upon the room was profound and healing. Sophia looked at Arthur, her eyes shining with tears, not of sadness, but of an overwhelming emotion. "You didn't have to do that for me," she whispered. Arthur turned to her, his face softened by a love he was finally not afraid to show. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheek. "I didn't do it for you, Sophia. I did it for us. There is no more me and you. There is what Leo drew on that paper, a family." He took a deep breath, the moment of his life's greatest clarity upon him. "I spent years making investments, diversifying my portfolio, always looking for the highest return. But the greatest investment I can make, the only bet I know will have an infinite return, is on our happiness." He knelt before her, not with the pomp of a prince, but with the humility of a man who had found his true north. "I don't have a ring right now, and no gold or diamond would be enough to represent what you mean to me. But I have a heart that you fixed, a life that you saved, and a future I can't imagine without you. Sophia, marry me. Marry us." Sophia's tears finally fell, hot and liberating. She knelt down with him, hugging him tightly. "Yes," she cried into his shoulder. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." And in that embrace, all conflicts dissolved. The pain of the past, the fear of the future, The pressure of the outside world, it all vanished, leaving only the promise of a love that was, finally, the most valuable treasure of all. The sterling mansion was no longer a mausoleum of marble, but a vibrant canvas painted with the sounds of life. The ticking of the old grandfather clock, once the metronome of loneliness, was now lost amidst laughter. The clatter of pans in the kitchen, and the out-of-tune melodies played by small hands on a xylophone. A year had passed since the rainy night that had cleansed Arthur's soul. He and Sophia had married in a simple ceremony in the mansion's garden, the same one where Leo now chased butterflies, joy radiating from his face. The wedding was not a grand social event to seal deals or merge fortunes. It was a quiet promise, witnessed by a handful of true friends and a boy who was the embodiment of the love that united them. The house was reborn. The heavy curtains were replaced with light fabrics that danced with the breeze, and the fresh flowers Sophia arranged every morning filled the air with the scent of a new beginning. Arthur discovered that his greatest calling was not to be a billionaire, but to be a father and a husband. He learned how to make Leo's favorite pasta, to recognize constellations in the night sky, and to understand that the most valuable silence was not that of absence, but of shared peace. His partners and the business world noticed the change. He remained an astute investor, but his approach had shifted. He began investing in companies with purpose, in projects that built something beyond profit. His former obsession with growing his fortune had been replaced by a desire to use his wealth to create a legacy of kindness. He would look at his old reports on assets, liabilities, and the volatile crypto market and see only empty numbers. The true accounting of his life was in the smiles he helped create, in Leo's daily progress, in the warmth of Sophia's hand in his. That was the only treasure that mattered, the only capital that yielded dividends for the soul. That evening, the scene in the dining room was the antithesis of everything the house had once represented. The immense mahogany table, once a desert of solitude, was now simply set for three. There was no formal silverware or sophisticated cuisine. There was a steaming platter of homemade pasta and a colorful salad. Arthur sat at the head of the table, but not like a king on his throne. He was leaning forward, cutting Leo's pasta into smaller pieces. Sophia, beside him, poured juice, and the three of them chatted about their day, about a small bird Leo saw in the garden and a funny-shaped cloud. Leo, who once barely touched his food, now ate with a healthy appetite, his fork held firmly in his hand. He paused for a moment, looked at his father, then at Sophia, one on each side of him, and a pure, wise smile lit up his face. In the sweet, clear voice he now used with confidence, he said the sentence that summed it all up, the final truth they had built together. "I eat now because you stay with me." Arthur felt a lump form in his throat, but these were tears of pure happiness. He reached across the table and took Sophia's hand. The look they exchanged contained a universe of gratitude, of resilience, and of unshakable love. Money couldn't heal a broken heart, but love could. Fortune couldn't buy a smile, but presence could. Wealth couldn't fill an empty home, but a family could. There, at that table, Arthur Sterling understood the fundamental truth of his existence. He was no longer a man defined by his staggering net worth, but by his infinite love. He was, finally, the richest man in the world,